Hi, my name is Gillian Gray, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. I'm going to be talking today about the Pragmatic Pluralist Approach to Social Categories of Identity. First, I just wanted to thank the organizers of Social Ontology 2021 and to say that I'm looking forward to any questions and comments you all might have about this presentation. All right. In this paper, I recommend a theoretical approach to discussions of social categories of identity, categories which double as playing an important role in our identities and in how our social world is currently carved up. Now, I don't take these to be deeply metaphysically connected or perfectly analogous categories, but categories like race, gender, sexual orientation, and disability all share the same features of being related to who one is, being bound up in complex systems of privilege and subordination, and involving a confusingly wide array of often conflicting associations, ranging from purportedly physical and or innate features to self-identifications to social positioning. So in this way, they're all contingently related. So I'm going to start off here with the following two basic assumptions. First, when I ask about my gender or my race or so on, I'm asking a who am I question. I'm asking about who I am. Second, who am I is just too broad of a question to result in meaningful answers. To make sense of who we are, we need to ask more specific questions. But it isn't clear that one specific question, one single question, is really going to give me a good sense of who I am. So similarly, I suggest that questions like what is race and what is gender are too broad to provide meaningful answers that help us better understand ourselves, each other, and our social world. And I recommend that we instead take an approach which recognizes a nexus of race and gender related questions like who do I take myself to be and how do others perceive me? And because I don't take any of these specific questions to give the full picture of who someone is with regards to a particular social category, I take it that none of these particular questions take metaphysical priority. Such an approach, I argue, has three important benefits. First, it better explains individual experience of identities like gender. Second, it can help us to more clearly distinguish different types of oppression. And third, it sets a helpful backdrop for explaining several identity-based normative issues. All right, so I call the approach that I recommend here a pragmatic pluralist approach. And with the scene now set, I'll turn to my first goal to describe the ways in which I see this approach as being both pluralist and pragmatic. I'll then go on to explain in more depth each of the theoretical virtues that I just mentioned. Okay, start by considering the following two competing accounts, each of which sets out to answer the question, what is race? Quaishon Spencer takes race to pick out real biological kinds that map onto population genetics, while Sally Haslinger takes race to pick out social kinds. These are taken to be competing accounts, but it's unsurprising that in a response to Spencer, Haslinger notes that the two views are not directly in conflict since they're answering different questions. We can see the conflict between Haslinger and Spencer as being at a higher level. It's a conflict about which question we are and ought to be asking when we ask what is race. For Spencer, when we ask about race, we ought to be asking about what features a person has, specifically about their genetics. By contrast, for Haslinger, asking about race is about how others perceive a person as a way of understanding social structures of privilege and subordination. The theoretical approach I'm recommending here is pluralist, and it says that both questions are worth pursuing, that both help us to understand who someone is with greater complexity, and that there simply isn't an answer that determines who someone really is with regards to their race in a deep metaphysical sense. There are four questions in total that I think are worth pursuing when thinking about social categories of identity. First, what relatively stable features do I have? Second, who do I take myself to be? Third, how do I present myself to others? And fourth, how do others perceive me? Although I'm not committed to these four questions being the only four necessary to get a full picture of who one is with regards to these social categories of identity, I do think that they provide a useful start and cover the questions most salient to the various scenarios where social categories like race, gender, and sexual orientation operate. Which question is at issue has to do with the social and political landscape, though, so we may need more or fewer questions in future, depending on changes to this landscape. The pragmatic pluralist approach takes all 4 questions I've identified to provide potentially useful information in understanding who someone is with regards to a given social category. It's not pluralist in the sense that there can be unlimited conflicting answers to a single question. Thus, this approach sees Spencer's and Haslinger's views not as being in competition, but as potentially working in tandem. By contrast, theories that seek to provide answers to the same specific questions could be in direct competition. Importantly, this approach is not meant to guide us in actually choosing among these theories and remains neutral on that front. I'll now say a bit about what makes the approach a pragmatic one. When I say that this approach takes multiple questions to be important to answer, I don't mean that every question will always be the most relevant in every situation, even if they all can help make sense of who we are. We can think back to Haslinger and Spencer, who are focused on 2 very different areas where race plays a role. Spencer is interested in race's role in medical genetics, while Haslinger is interested in understanding and addressing oppression. But answering the question of how individuals are socially positioned with regards to race won't be particularly relevant to medical genetics, and answering the question of what genetic features a person has won't fully explain race-based oppression. Not every question is relevant in every situation. The pragmatic pluralist approach is pragmatic in that it states that one or another question may have more salience depending on what role the social category plays in the situation we're interested in. I'll now discuss in greater depth what I mean by each of these 4 questions. The goal here is to understand why each of the 4 questions I discuss are important to understanding who someone is with regards to a particular social category. Here I'll shift away from race and gender and focus on sexual orientation. First, I'll start with the question, what relatively stable features do I have? The question refers to some features which, although certainly not always fully outside the realm of possibility to change, are nonetheless quite difficult to change because they're generally taken to be the result of nature, genetics, environment, or other sources besides one's own control. To take sexual orientation as an example, the relevant, relatively stable given features would have to do with one's attraction to other sexes and/or genders. However, this is cashed out depending on which philosophical view you find most appealing. The second question is, who do I take myself to be? This question picks out one's self-identity. Self-identity involves developing an understanding of oneself in light of one's relatively stable features or in response to social norms that are taken to govern various identities. For example, in the case of sexual self-identity, a person might recognize that she is attracted to women, but only after reflection and consideration, decide that she self-identifies as a lesbian in light of these attractions. Alternatively, she may not see the norms of heterosexuality as being relevant to her. For example, in the case of a woman who, despite whatever attraction she has, doesn't feel moved to have sex with men and so chooses to identify as a lesbian because she finds the norms surrounding that identity more fitting. With regards to the third question, how do I present myself to others? I propose borrowing the concept of agential identity from Kat St. Croix and Robin Dembroff, given that the question received little to no attention prior to their raising it. Dembroff and St. Croix explain that, quote, agential identities are the self-identities we take switch the slide there. Agential identities are the self-identities we make available to others. They bridge what we take ourselves to be with what others take us to be, end quote. Perhaps more accurately, agential identities attempt to bridge what we take ourselves to be with what others take us to be. They may not always receive uptake. So when I refer to sexual agential identity, I'm referring to the agential identity a person has in relation to their sexual self-identity. For example, the person described above might self-identify as a lesbian, but only decide after some time that she wants to make this identity publicly known by coming out and taking on a lesbian agential identity. Finally, we can ask, how do others perceive me? Social position is the way other people view you with regards to a particular social category. In occupying a particular social position, you're perceived by others as being a member of a particular social group. Like Sally Haslinger in her accounts of race and gender, I think it's most fitting to think of social position not as being determined by actual features of the person under consideration, but rather perceived features. In some cases, one's social position will be determined on the basis of successful uptake given their agential identity, but not always. Importantly, on my understanding of this term, one need not actually be attracted to women or self-identify as a lesbian or have a lesbian agential identity to occupy a lesbian social position. This may seem radical. However, I think this best explains the variety of experiences a person can have and account for ways in which a person who is taken to be a member of a non-straight social group can still face sexuality-based discrimination despite not actually having the presumed group membership features. In short, the type of account that this question is seeking is one which specifically addresses how one is viewed and treated by society, which importantly can come apart from one's relatively stable features, her self-identity, and her agential identity. To further motivate why all of these questions are important to ask, it's helpful to think about the breadth of experiences that people have with regards to social categories, and how the answers to these different questions can lead to very different results for a given individual. There are a number of ways these can come apart, so some examples can help here. I'll mention a few fairly commonplace, albeit stereotypical, stories about sexuality that can be told for some of them. So take, for example, Lana, a woman who is taken by others to be a straight woman who's just rebellious or going through an experimental phase, but is actually attracted to women and self-identifies as bisexual. Maria and Monica, despite being attracted to women, might write off these feelings and self-identify as straight, projecting this self-identity to others through their agential identities. Maria continues to maintain a straight social position, while Monica is nonetheless seen by others publicly as a lesbian, perhaps due to some perceivable factors by others that are interpreted as indicative of lesbianism. Priya identifies as one sort of political lesbian who truly has no sexual attraction towards women, but chooses nonetheless to engage sexually only with women, and bases her sexual identity on this politically motivated choice. In each of these examples of Lana, Maria, Monica, and Priya, only scratch the surface of the range of complex and intricate experiences a person might have with regards to her identity. For example, a person's sexual self-identity is often much more complex than simply identifying as a lesbian. In reality, these experiences will be even more complex and varied than the brief caricatures presented above. This, I think, provides an important reason for adopting a pluralist approach. It's explanatorily helpful and can make sense of the nuances of identity without over or under generalizing in ways that a non-pluralist approach would. Given the plethora of divergent experiences I outlined above, it's unlikely that prioritizing a single question will avoid being over or under inclusive as a way of explaining who one really is with regards to their sexual orientation. And likely will leave out a significant amount of nuance in the way that different facets of a person's identity can come apart in important ways. On the theoretical approach I recommend here, the complexity of our experiences with a social category is central to what that category is. This approach refuses to resolve apparently fraught cases, taking them as paradigm rather than fringe cases for the identities I discuss here. In this way, the approach predicts, rather than explains as an afterthought, cases that non-pluralist approaches see as fraught. So another motivation for a view like the pragmatic pluralist approach is to better identify and explain different forms of identity-based oppression. Think back to the individuals I noted in the previous section. Importantly, those people will have different experiences, as discussed earlier, and these carry over to their experiences of oppression and discrimination as well. As I'll further discuss here, there are different forms of oppression one can experience on the basis of their stable features, self-identity, agential identity, and social position. I'll start with the distinction already made by philosopher Matthew Andler. Andler distinguishes between orientation-based sexuality oppression and identity-based sexuality oppression. The former occurs when someone is oppressed with regards to their interests involving dispositions to sexual behavior and desires. The latter, identity-based sexuality oppression, is more directly related to suppression of one's identity expression. Like Andler, I think that distinguishing between sexual orientation and identity gives us better tools for explaining different types of oppression. But I think that we need to make these distinctions even more fine-grained than those proposed by Andler. Each of the four distinct types of oppression that I discussed line up with the four different questions that I discussed in the previous section. We can start with features a person might have. Sexual orientation oppression, as described by Andler, is an example of this. Oppression at the level of sexual orientation occurs when someone is denied the opportunity to act on their desires or manifest their dispositions to engage in sexual and/or romantic behaviors with certain people. Examples include criminalizing sexual acts between people of the same sex or gender, or preventing people of the same sex or gender from raising children. Importantly, this form of oppression is confined to the realm of sexual and romantic desires and behaviors themselves. Sexual self-identity oppression occurs when someone is prevented from forming a fitting sexual self-identity. Other examples include lacking the concepts necessary to form a non-heterosexual identity because your social conditions are such that you don't have access to any non-heterosexual identity concepts, or trying to form a fitting self-identity in conditions where you've been convinced that even taking on such an identity would be deeply wrong or deviant. Sexual agential identity oppression has to do with oppressive barriers to expression of one's identity, as well as lack of respect for one's identity expression. Examples include cases where someone is assumed to be going through a rebellious or experimental phase rather than actually being gay, or when someone is seen as gay on the basis of misguided stereotypes or faces stigmatization for wearing clothing with slogans that would constitute expressing their identity. Note that there is clearly overlap with cases that also exhibit oppression at the level of sexual orientation, but the effect is different here. The oppressive effect here is not about being unable to act in accordance with one's desires or attractions, but about not being able to express a public identity in line with one's self-identity. Sexual social position oppression is perhaps the most obvious and familiar, and occurs when there's discrimination on the basis of social group membership. Examples include being denied service in a store or being fired from a job. Although there are connections between these, it's important to keep them separate to identify and address the different kinds of oppression at play in each of these cases. Okay, finally, I'll close by briefly considering how this approach can make progress when it comes to two normative issues regarding identity. First, it paves the way for a critical analysis of cases where people are accused of being deceivers or attempting to pass. It can seem like a case of passing when there's a mismatch between what others perceive one to be, for example, a woman, and some relatively given features like having a penis. Social position based on others' perceptions can easily misalign with relatively given facts about a person, making it seem like the person is passing. Other examples include a person with an underlying impairment who's perceived as not being disabled because she, quote, looks normal, perhaps based on an incorrect assumption that, for example, a lack of cane or wheelchair communicates lack of impairment, or a woman who's attracted to women who is perceived as being straight because she has a femme presentation, perhaps based on an incorrect assumption that femme presentation communicates heterosexuality, or a person with Black ancestry who's perceived as white because she has light skin, perhaps based on an incorrect assumption that light skin and no mention of Blackness communicates one does not have such background. On my view, which is heavily inspired by Talia May Betcher's arguments in Evil Deceivers and Make-Believers, there are certain norms in place according to which some facets of a person's identity are seen as communicating information about other facets of their identity. For example, a person's gender presentation is taken to communicate a person's sex body. This communicative approach, in conjunction with the pluralist approach I've outlined in this paper, gives us the resources to understand why there can be seeming misalignments between someone's social position, agential identity, self-identity, and relatively stable or given features. But these are only genuine misalignments if we endorse the communication norms that underlie them. For many of these, we have good reason not to endorse those norms. So, in short, pluralist approach plus an account of communicative norms gives us an explanation of what goes wrong in these cases. Second, a pluralist approach can set the groundwork for understanding why and how someone can be harmed for what appears to be a mismatch between how others perceive them and how they really are. In many cases, we might be tempted to respond by saying that the wrong is in misclassifying someone. For example, if we take gender to straightforwardly correspond to solely gender identity, let's say that someone who denies a person's gender identity has made a metaphysical mistake. However, I think the pluralist approach sets us up for a more explanatorily satisfying answer. How others perceive us can govern what sets of norms we're expected to follow. Thus, one's social position can set expectations that one will respond to certain norms. However, our identities are often taken to have to do with what norms we find relevant to us, whether we follow or flout the norms. If one's self-identity doesn't match one's social position, one can be in the disorienting position of being expected to respond to norms that one does not find relevant to oneself. So, in short, if we combine a norm relevance account and an account of social norms, along with the background pluralist approach I've described here, we get the start of an explanation for a harm that occurs when we have a social position that doesn't line up with our identity. Of course, these are just the beginnings of these separate projects, but I think that we can use a pluralist approach like the one I've outlined here as a useful backdrop for getting these projects started to explain these interesting normative issues related to identity. All right. So in conclusion, I've outlined and motivated a new theoretical approach to questions about social categories of identities. And according to this approach, there are multiple facets to social categories of identity that are non-reducible to each other, and they're picked out by four main questions we can ask about ourselves. The account has three attractions that I've discussed in this talk. It better explains individuals' actual experiences by making paradigm cases out of what would otherwise be seen as fraught cases, where the answers to these questions come apart for a single individual. Second, it better distinguishes between four distinct forms of identity-based oppression, which can help us to identify and address these forms of oppression. And third, it provides a useful backdrop for explaining several identity-related normative issues that I think would be interesting to explore in further work using this approach as a backdrop. All right, thank you all. I'm curious to hear your questions and your thoughts, and yeah, thank you.